Influences, hosted by Carla DeVito.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jethro Tull!
Hey, sitting on the park bench, eyeing little girls with bad intent. Stopped running down his nose, and greasy fingers smearing shabby clothes. Hey, Aqualung, he's dying in the cold sun, watching as a pretty the panties run. Oh, Aqualung, and feeling like a dead duck, spitting out pieces of his broken luck. Hey, Aqualung, sun streaking cold, alone and wandering lonely, taking time the only way he knows. Hair hurting bad as he bends to pay good doggings. Well, he goes down to the bunk and warms his feet. Feeling alone, the armies of the roads, salvation and a moat and a cup of tea. Aqualung, my friend, and don't you start away uneasy. Oh, you pour out heart, oh, you see, it's only a me. You still remember the summer's foggy breeze, when the ice that clings onto your bed was screaming agony. Hey, and your steps were like Levi's prints with deep-sea tireless sounds, and the flowers bloom like memories in the spring. Sun streaking cold, an old man wandering lonely, and taking time the only way he knows. Leg hurting bad as he bends to pick a dog end. Well, he goes down to the bar and warms his feet. Oh, 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 I'm feeling alone, and they always hop on the road. Salvation and a moat and a cup of tea. Aqualung, my friend, don't you start away uneasy, or you pour out hard, you see it's only me. Aqualung, my friend, don't you start away uneasy, or you pour out hot, oh, you see, it's only me. Oh, you know it's only me.
I'm Carla DeVito, and welcome to Rock Influences. Tonight we've got something really special for you. Beginning in the late 60s and continuing right up to the present day, one of the most creative and experimental forms of popular music has been progressive rock. It's as hard to define as rock itself, but one thing's for sure, it always seems to grow out of an artist's need to stretch himself musically and to expand the limits of basic rock and roll. We're lucky enough to have in concert one of the innovators of progressive rock from the 60s to today, Jethro Tull. And Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull will help guide us through our show. We'll begin our journey into the past and present of progressive rock.
Well, I think the word progressive in relation to rock always suggests something to do with musicality. But I think it also suggests some level of invention, some creativity, something that's a bit special, for want of a better word. But I think it always suggests musicality. Now, whether that musicality is the overblown, overly dramatic, pompous sort of music of bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer, or Yes, or Jethro Who, you know, from the 70s period, or whether it's actually, should we say, the more accepted sort of musicality of bands, progressive jazz rock groups like Weather Report or whatever. I mean, it still suggests the ability to play your instrument well, inventively, and to be a sort of master of it.
Not surprisingly, the Beatles assumed leadership of the progressive rock movement. At the same time that they were reaffirming the irresistibility of basic rock and roll, they were also pushing the boundaries of the music to include more and more challenging forms of expression. In the summer of 1967, they released their masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This one album manages to incorporate many different songs and styles of music, all linked together conceptually from first track to last.
Procol Harum came together in London in 1966. Lyricist Keith Reid's images were combined with Gary Brooker's adaptation of Bach's Sleepers Awake to create the classic composition A Whiter Shade of Pale, which rose to the top of the charts worldwide.
We skip the light fandango, turns cartwheels across the floor. I was feeling kind of seasick. The crowd called out for more. The room was humming harder as the ceiling flew away. When we call out for another dream,
when it was actually happening, it was just people making music, you know. I think when you look back, perhaps as soon as 2 or 3 years later, you see that, you know, some people were doing some pretty fantastic things, you know, but I think at the time it was just people just trying to play as good a music as they could, and that was the way it came out, you know. I don't think you can be consciously avant-garde, you know. I think if you think you're going to be avant-garde, then you're likely to miss it by several thousand miles.
Another classically influenced group of the 60s, still going strong in the 80s, is the Moody Blues. They started out as just another British invasion band, but separated themselves from the pack with the release of their 1967 album, Days of Future Past, recorded with the London Festival Orchestra. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, no artist was as essential to the idea of progressive rock in the U.S. as Frank Zappa in his Mothers of Invention. From the very start, Zappa achieved critical acclaim and a devoted cult audience for his fusions of jazz and classical music with rock and roll, his wit, and his daring experimentation with audio montages and free-form expression.
I would put him as, you know, right up there in terms of American progressive rock music as being a very influential person, not in as much as his music may have not directly influenced people, but what he stood for certainly influenced a lot of people, including me. So I may not have influenced Frank Zappa, but in his own way, I'm sure he's influenced me and people of, you know, my ilk.
I'm a person who likes to do what he wants to do and has worked at it for 20 years and can generally do what he wants to do, whether people like it or not. And what I do is designed for people who like it, not for people who don't. And I have no desire to inflict it on people who don't want to consume it. And I'm committed to turning out as much of it as possible for the people who like it. It's there if you like it. If you don't like it, there's all those other names on the list.
Another dimension of the classical influence on progressive rock was the whole idea of a rock opera. Now, there were many experimenters with this longer form for rock, the Kinks, the Pretty Things, and the Small Faces, among others, but the question remained, who would succeed first? And as it happened, the Who did succeed first.
Aqualung actually, a lot of people think was a concept album, but I remember at the time in all the interviews that I did saying, no, it's not a concept album at all, but it doesn't matter whether you say it or not. People, they get that in their heads, they believe it. Whereas Thick as a Brick, the album after that, I then had got, by then, used to the idea that I was supposed to now be the author of concept albums. I thought we'd do one.
Really don't mind if you sit this one out. Our words but a whisper, your deafness ain't shout. I may make you feel, but I can't make you think. Your sperm's in the gutter, your love's in the sink. Saw you ride your sands on the fields, and you make all your animal deals, and your wise men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick. Hey! And the sandcastle virtues are all swept away in the tidal distraction, the morrow Monday. The elastic retreats brings a close up. As the last wave uncovers the newfangled way. But your new shoes are worn at the heels, and your suntan is rapidly peeled, and your wires men don't know how it feels to be thick as a brick. That I feel is so far away. I'm a bad dream that I just had today. And you shake your head, yes, you said it's a shame. of your tent. As the center of the fathers of pens, with the blood of the bulls and the touch of the wires, and from the back part of your bed. Let me make you a present of song, as the wires and bricks wind and is gone, and the fall in the hourglass is cooking his goose on the nursery rhyme winds along. I've come down from the upper class to men who wanted awakenings. My father was a man of power who met with one of things.
Following the release of their classic 1970 album, John Barleycorn Must Die, 60s veterans Traffic earned newfound respect for their unique blend of jazz, rock, and traditional folk music.
I think the thing about Traffic was that I can tell you for a fact that we never ever spiced anything up, you know, overdubbed and mixed and put it through 10 different machines backwards, and then, you know, and then worked for 6 weeks on the snare drum and got the... We just played, you know.
In the late 60s and early 70s, the organ and the mellotron came into prominence as primary instruments in the rapidly expanding world of progressive rock. The mellotron, a synthesizer that uses tapes of pre-recorded sounds, was a key element in the music of King Crimson, particularly on their...
Wide Open, which was fantastic, and all that you had to do was be different from the previous band. Kind of unlike now, where kids regrettably have to be very like the previous band in order to get a job. You see what I mean? And then the whole thing was, if you sound like, if the bands that were around when I started, namely Yes, King Crimson, Moody Blues, Nice, Jethro Tull, etc., if you sounded like any of those people, forget it. You know, the point was to be different. And that's slightly different now. You know, and so it was very exciting. We could do anything we wanted to do, and did.
King Crimson, I think, were very interesting at the time they first appeared on the scene. I mean, they came along with early Traffic, Spooky Tooth, Yes, Jethro Tull. All those bands were bands that played at the Marquee Club in London, which spawned, before that, the first wave of blues groups, you know, the Rolling Stones and Alexis Korner and all those guys that began there. Subsequently, the sort of progressive music boom of the late 60s, early 70s, most of the bands we've been talking about have, you know, been marquee resident groups. Crimson, along with Traffic, you know, were two bands that I used to regularly go and see there because they were, I mean, a very charged atmosphere when both of those bands played.
Meanwhile, Keith Emerson's antics on the organ earned him a reputation as the Hendrix of the keyboards, first in the 60s with the Nice, and then later in the 70s with Emerson, Lake, and Palmer. One of the most phenomenally successful progressive rock bands of the 70s was Yes. Their appeal was based on three main elements: glorious harmonies, virtuoso instrumentals, and classically derived structures.
Roundabout was a song that in 1972 gave John Anderson and myself quite a special award for one of the most popular songs of that year, and I think, you know, that in itself was a nice thing to get, and it rewarded John and I and the group for writing a song and arranging it in such a highly original fashion.
Obviously our music's always been very eclectic, and is so even now. In other words, it uses a lot of influence from a lot of different sources, and we put those together, hopefully not in a pastiche form. We try to make the edges dovetail a bit, you know, but it is nonetheless eclectic. And perhaps that very eclecticism is something that also is shared by a lot of other bands, like, again, we mentioned Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer. There are a lot of different things in there, you know, that are coming together, sometimes awkwardly, but still with something special going for them. So maybe that very eclectic nature is a very important thing as well, sort of almost a clashing of different influences somehow almost meeting, you know. This can be exciting.
Certainly another progressive rock success story of the 70s was Pink Floyd. Their 1973 album Dark Side of the Moon catapulted them to mass audience popularity. Their music contained elements of every conceivable musical form, woven together in lengthy suite-like compositions that dealt with the more ominous aspects of contemporary life.
Dark Side of the Moon was the discovery of a format, really. It's a format within which I've been working ever since. It's a format that I'm comfortable with, you know. I like the idea of an album being about one specific thing and all the songs within it relating back to a central theme or idea.
Music has always been a kind of melting pot of anything, you know, anything that's going, or for me it is anyway, and for us, anything that seems a good idea at the time can be thrown in.
We took it all very seriously. We thought it was, you know, no, we didn't think of it as rock and roll. It was progressive, maybe progressive rock, or maybe that was a term that developed later.
I suppose the first sort of progressive rock that influenced me in any musical way was very early Pink Floyd, the very first album, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which I found to be a terrific lesson in combining quirky songwriting with, you know, then amazing sound effects and amazing theatricality on stage. So, although again they were perhaps more in the art rock genre as they were perceived at the time, I mean, they were still truly progressive in the sense that it unleashed a whole new kind of influence for a lot of musicians.
After performing with Meatloaf in the rock video Paradise by the Dashboard Lights, I realized how essential staging can be to a musical performance. So it doesn't surprise me that theatricality was so important to progressive rock. Early Genesis, for example, combined creative lighting, provocative slides, and elaborate costume changes into a mesmerizing stage show. In the 1980s, Genesis continues in the forefront of progressive rock, with drummer Phil Collins leading the way.
Stay with me, my love. I hope you'll always be right here by my side. If ever I need you, oh my love, in your arms I feel so safe and so secure. Every day is such a perfect day to spend along with you. I will follow you, will you follow me? All the days and nights that we know will be, I will stay with you, will you stay with me? Just one single tear in each passing year.
David Bowie has adopted and discarded more identities than any other single artist in rock and roll history. But it was as Ziggy Stardust that Bowie shot to stardom in 1972 with an exotic theatrical stage presentation that captured the imagination of rock and roll fans everywhere. Through all of his many and varied transformations, Bowie remains one of the most dynamic and consistently interesting performers in all of popular music.
More than anything else, I saw that a lot of my songs were very illustrative and picturesque. And I felt there were other ways of performing on stage. I was never very confident of my voice, you see, as a singer. So I thought, rather than just sing them, which would probably bore the pants off everybody, I'd like to kind of portray the songs, rather than just sing them.
This is ground control to Major Tom. You've really made the grade. And the papers just want to know whose shirt you wear. Now it's time to leave the capsule if you dare. This is Major Tom to ground control. I'm stepping through the door, and I'm floating in a most peculiar way. And the stars look very different today. For here am I sitting in a tin can, far above the world. Planet Earth is blue, and there's nothing I can do.
Theatricality is sort of, it comes with the show in the sense that you go out there on the stage and either you are that way inclined or you're not.
Without a doubt, progressive rock is still a viable form in the 80s. It's been trimmed of some of its excesses, but it's healthier, more diverse, and more experimental than ever. You can hear it in the music of bands like Talking Heads, Devo, Thomas Dolby, A Flock of Seagulls, and Spandau Ballet. Spandau Ballet came out of the art scene in London in 1979. Their albums and live appearances depend on experimental instrumentation and imaginative stage presentations.
Lennon and McCartney grew up listening to transistor radios and music. Well, we grew up watching the telly, because we were born in the generation that had TV for the first time, in England anyway. I mean, TV really didn't become popular until sort of the late 60s. And then in the sort of early 70s, it became colour. And so my only pop education was visual, and it didn't just concern music. It was like Mad from Uncle, Batman, and commercials and soap operas. So it made more sense that when bands like ourselves, our generation, came along, that we would step much more into making visual things and videos and seeing a visual concept.
Check the time, well it was almost time. Kinda curious smell, intangible crime. Well, I'm washing my clothes, things still grow. Why don't you cover your eyes? These things will still show. I feel the grace against my skin. I feel the grace against my skin. I know this feeling is a lie. I know this feeling is a lie. There is a guilt within my mind. There is a guilt within my mind. I know this feeling is a lie. I know this feeling is a lie. I don't need this pressure on. 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 I don't need this pressure on.
Jerry Casale and Mark Mothersbaugh met at Kent State University in the mid-'70s and formed Devo, a multimedia band incorporating philosophies of de-evolution with innovative videos, high-tech gloss, and electronic bop.
Well, you know, Devo was always interested in the big picture, not just operating within current musical styles or getting our information from music. We were taking everything, every influence. I mean, just human behavior in general. We were trying to be thoroughly modern, not futuristic or with some kind of just shallow stylistic come-on, but in terms of responding now, not responding with styles and modes and thoughts from the past. So we were basically trying to clean out do a big spring cleaning on all the retrograde and bankrupt, constipated imagery and ideas that music seemed to be suffering at the time we came along.
Secret agent man. Secret agent man. Secret agent man. They've given me a number, but they've taken away my name. I got one hell of a job to perform for the got the responsibility of our nation's top security. But every night and day, I salute the flag and say, thank you, Jesus, 'cause I'm a secret agent man.
I think the flag of progressive rock is still flying, but no one really wants to call it progressive rock music anymore. But it certainly ain't just, you know, common or garden sort of, you know, run-of-the-mill pop music as far as I'm concerned. There are some special things still happening and always will be happening.
Well, once again, our time is running short. But if we've proven anything tonight, it's that progressive rock is here to stay, as long as there are individuals and groups consistently willing to challenge themselves, their music, and their audiences. Jethro Tull is still doing that in concert today. I'll see you next time on Rock Influences.